episode 234 of the Book Cougars, two middle-aged women on the hunt for a good read. I'm Emily.
And I'm Chris. And we have two fantastic new patrons to thank. Big thanks to Kathy and Diane for joining our community over on Patreon. We so appreciate your support.
We're so happy to have you. Chris, what are you currently reading?
I'm currently reading One of Ours by Willa Cather. This is for Colleen's Year of Reading Cather. I was a little hesitant because this has been my favorite, I say, quote, favorite Cather novel for some time now. And it's been a while since I read it, so I was a little like, let's see. I'm, of course, loving it. I just think it's one of her best. I mean, she won the Pulitzer for it. It was controversial, like this year's Pulitzer was controversial in a way. But it's her World War I novel about a guy, Claude Wheeler, who grows up the son of very successful pioneers in Nebraska, and his discontent and not feeling like he fits in and wondering if this is all life has to offer. So really good. I can't wait for our conversation with this. I have a couple of sticky notes, and one of them is, so World War I breaks out. And of course, people in the Midwest, people all over the United States then didn't have a great grasp of geography, especially of the particulars of France. So I have a note here saying maps and reference books play starring role because everyone's like, they're getting the news, they're reading the newspapers, and they want to learn more about where the action is happening over there and where are the rivers in relation to Paris and things like that. So One of Ours by Willa Cather. I'm happy to hear that other folks in the group are really enjoying it as well.
Right on. I'm glad that it didn't disappoint. We should probably say what happened with the Pulitzer is that Percival Everett, who wrote James, won for fiction this year, but 3 women were nominated and they couldn't decide. So they threw all 3 of those out and chose James instead.
Which just seems so messed up. And there's also the issue of James being kind of derivative or based on another story. I love the book, James. I think it's a fantastic work of literature. So no shade on that, but there are just controversies surrounding a lot of these awards.
Yes.
Yeah.
But speaking of the Pulitzer, I happen to be reading Feeding Ghosts, a graphic memoir by Tessa Holes, which won the Pulitzer for biography memoir. This is her first book. It took her 10 years to write, and she had to teach herself to draw in order to do it. The images are just spectacular. Full disclosure, this was waiting for me at the library on reserve, and for the life of me, I could not remember how I had ended up putting it on reserve. I could guess that it had the word ghosts in it, and I was thinking it could be good for our year of reading ghosts, but I'm sure I read about it somewhere. And it is about this Tessa's grandmother and mother and their history. And her grandmother was a journalist that fled from China to Hong Kong. And when she got there, she wrote a memoir that was a bestseller. And then she fell into deep mental illness that she never recovered from. But Tessa and her mother ended up living in the United States, and her grandmother eventually came, and her grandmother was always a mystery to her. And this memoir is her unraveling the mystery of her grandmother. And then obviously that helps to unravel the mystery of your mother and your relationship with your mother. It's very ghosty in the drawings. I'm showing Chris, like every page has these drawings that kind of look like ghost mouths, like screaming. Yeah. Beautiful, black and white. I'm deep into the prologue. There's a prologue and then 9 parts and an epilogue. Really enjoying it and looking forward to spending more time with it soon.
I'm also reading a graphic novel. This is Renegade Girls, a queer tale of romance and rabble-rousing. It's written by Nora Noose and illustrated by Julie Robine. And it is about 2 young women in the late 19th century New York City. One who wants to be a journalist, a stunt girl, as they call them. And then the other who is a photographer. And then there's the third woman who is an Italian woman of a lower class than these other 2 upper class women, who works in a clothing factory and also as a maid for the family. The woman who wants to be the writer, Nell is her name. And she's actually from Chicago, based on a real woman. in New York living with her aunt and uncle to get exposure to society and possibly find a husband is what the family has in mind for her. And she is not so inclined as much as she'd like to stay in New York. She wants to be a writer and meets Alice Austen, a street photographer. It's in color. I'm showing Emily. So some of the pages are a little muted here and there, but then for the most part, it's pretty colorful. I haven't gotten to the point where I'm noticing different color schemes for different characters. I've heard of graphic novels and memoirs and graphic history doing that, but it is showing the awful work conditions in these clothing factories when all the rage was for people to buy store-bought clothes and, women losing fingers, women having to buy the fabric that they're going to sew, and then also having to bring their own needle for the sewing machine, getting charged if the sewing machine breaks, just the horrific conditions, and that there are little girls working in this factory. So far, I'm enjoying it, and it's not a lot of text, which is nice, because you and I have talked before about sometimes we get pulled between the pictures and the words and what's a good balance. And I kind of feel like this one has a good balance for me so far.
That's very different than Tessa's. Tessa's is like each page is so dense with pictures and words. I'm going to show you the starting of it is just a timeline for the history of what happened, their Chinese history. And it's so many words, and you kind of have to follow the direction of how she wants you to read it. And each page is very much filled with that. But I'm really trying to take it slow and read and then look at the pictures. It's a practice in patience for me. Yeah.
And that's a larger format book, too, the one that Emily has. It's larger format, and it's hardcover, and it's thick. Renegade Girls is a smaller format paperback. More to come on that one.
I'm into The Good House by Tananarive Due. And this is our second quarter read-along book. I'm about 75%. And I don't really want to talk about it because we're going to be talking about it at length in a future episode. But I do want to just mention that I am listening to it as well as reading it. And it's narrated by Robin Miles, who's done a lot of narration, including Cast in the Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, which I know one of those you listened to on audio, I think. So you would recognize her voice, I'm sure. And I'm really enjoying the audiobook a lot. It goes back and forth in time and different characters. And Marie Toussaint, who is the grandmother, when she reads her character, that's hard for me. And then in the book, that's in italics, which is also hard for me. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. Going to the book didn't help me that much. So I've had to kind of re-listen to some of those sections. Chris talked about it being a slow burn, and I would agree with that. I feel like I'm at the part now where I'm like, okay, what's going on? Let's see what's going to happen here. And a reminder to everybody that we do have a Goodreads thread discussion for The Good House, and we're going to have a Zoom discussion on June 8th, 7 p.m. Eastern. Email us, bookcougars@gmail.com. if you would like to participate in our conversation about The Good House. I'm also reading The Forest for the Trees, An Editor's Advice to Writers by Betsy Lerner. When we talked to Iowan Ivy a couple episodes ago, or was that last episode? I'm embarrassed to say I don't remember.
Matthew was last,
right.
a couple episodes
ago. She talked about this being one of the craft books that she goes back to. It has the best cover. It's like these pencils that represent the forest. And then there are little, treetops on the pencils. And I've just started it, but it's really interesting. Betsy Lerner is both a writer, a published writer, and has been an editor and is now an agent. So she really sees the publishing industry from lots of different perspectives. I like her writing a lot. She's no nonsense and uses a few cuss words and tells stories. So I'm really enjoying it. Again, that's called The Forest for the Trees by Betsy Lerner. What did you just read?
Well, I finished The Good House by Tananarive Due, and I agree with Karen, a.k.a. Barker for Books, over on Instagram, that it is going to make for a good conversation, particularly the ending. So,
I can't wait to get to the ending.
I know. I read it exclusively on my e-reader. So I carried that thing with me all the time, was reading in bed, and it took a while.
Yeah, it's a long book.
Yeah. So
we appreciate those of you who are sticking with it.
Yes, I'm glad I started it early.
Yeah. I finished Leaving by Roxana Robinson. This is the book I picked up when I was with you and the gentleman caller at Breakwater for Independent Bookstore Day. And this is a later in life love story between Sarah and Warren, who met and were sweethearts when they were younger, and now they've met again in their 60s. And I just thought this book was so amazing. It did remind me a lot of Kent Harriff's Our Souls at Night, but this one takes a different turn than that novel did, and that novel was very slight. This one's a little bit longer. A lot of it's about how our family members react to our relationships when we're older. They didn't build a family together. They came back together and then had these family members that had opinions about their relationship, or maybe didn't want their own life to change. And that was one of my big takeaways from the novel, is like the aesthetics of a relationship. There are people who, one of their desires for being in relationship and building a family is to have that, quote, look of what a family is supposed to look like. And our daughter's going to get married and we're going to walk down the aisle as a happy couple, versus maybe being more interested in a genuine connection that you might have with somebody. And so she really explores that in this novel, starting with like, did I have that genuine connection to start in this relationship? Or when did I discover that I didn't? Mm-hmm. And what do you do if you're still in a relationship with that person that doesn't need that? So I just loved her writing and highly recommend this book.
Nice.
Yes. Again, it's called Leaving by Roxana Robinson.
Oh, well, I read a wonderful poetry collection called When I Was Straight by Julie Marie Wade. And I could not find the book this morning to put in my bag to bring. I wanted to read a couple lines from a couple poems talking about relationships, right? When I Was Straight. This collection is all about her coming out to herself, to other people, from family, friends, random people, and then kind of the things people say. Some of which are ridiculous, some are hurtful, some are really funny. Because I think I texted you one of the lines, which was when she was coming out to her college roommate, I believe it was. The roommate says all these things, and she's like, well, so then were you faking it when you said you liked the English Patient? Which made me laugh, because the English Patient was one of our first read-alongs that we did.
Was it the first? I don't know. We'd have to look that up. It was definitely in our first year of doing read-alongs.
Yeah. It was one that we both had always wanted to read but never got to. So I'm sorry I don't have the book with me. I really enjoyed it. It's a small format book, so it probably just got stuck between something. But I enjoyed those poems very much. And it brings the point home that, people often talk about, well, what's the big deal with coming out? And for most people, you don't come out just once, unless you're Ellen DeGeneres, who came out once, right? You're constantly having to say who you are and who you are in relationship with, because people always make assumptions. I cannot tell you how many times people have said to me, well, your husband, and I'll say, depending on the context and my level of giving a shit, I'll say my wife. Yeah. It's really rare to find somebody who will say, well, your partner. Or why do we even have to assume people have a partner?
Yeah, I'm raising my hand to that one, because I get that all the time. Well, shouldn't you ask your husband about this? And I'll say, I don't have one. Yeah. So, it really is interesting. Just the assumptions we make about people and their relationships based on probably our own. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right? And I think that's one of the lines of, like, when you are part of the mainstream, whatever the mainstream is in your culture, you don't have to think about anything else, any other way of being, because your way is the dominant way. And so you see the world that way. Mm-hmm. So anyway, it's a wonderful collection. Again, that was When I Was Straight by Julie Marie Wade. And I actually have a couple more books that I purchased by her. I really like her poetry. Oh, great. Read some the next episode. We'll be standing by. I also think it is interesting, like the emotional, I don't know if any of the poems dealt with this, but like when you have something to share and then you have to take care of someone else's emotions when you're sharing.
Yes.
Did she talk about that in her poems?
Yes. I don't recall a poem that goes into great detail about that specifically, but that is kind of infused throughout the collection.
Yeah. The other book I finished was Permission, The New Memoirist and the Courage to Create by Elissa Altman. And Elissa is our guest at the end of this episode, so we won't talk about it very long right now. But it does tell the story of her banishment from family after revealing a secret. And she does talk about what that secret is when we talk with her. And then how she had to handle that moving forward and how it affected her life. And again, it's like this theme, you know, how we talk about reading themes. I was like, oh, aesthetics again. You know, like here are family members that wanted it to look a certain way. And when she wrote something that was her own truth, it threatened that. And the way they handled it was to banish her from the family, which, you know, their loss. I'm saying that glibly. I know it's a heavy burden. She also is talking as someone who teaches memoir. So it's also very much a craft book in the sense of how do we give ourselves permission? And she talks some of the roadblocks and hurdles like shame, which we never got a chance to talk about with her, unfortunately. But who has a right to tell the stories and what keeps us from being able to do it? I cannot recommend this book enough. And the audiobook is fantastic. She narrates. So if you're looking for a new audiobook. And I do think that this is a good read, whether you want to be a writer or not, just to understand the role of story in people's lives.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. I did a heavy skim of the book in preparation for our recording, and I plan on listening to the audio. She doesn't go into the nuts and bolts of writing advice. It is more about storytelling and the stories you choose to tell and repercussions by way of her own examples. And it's just so, I don't even know what the right word is that, you know, the secret is about her grandmother leaving the family. She had a husband and 2 young kids, and she left for 3 or 4 years. And the son tells the story to Elissa, the son being her father. And then the sister, her father's sister, never tells her children and family about that. And then they cut her out. Like, it's like, so you have abandonment, and then the family turns around and cuts her out. Like,
right. They reenact.
I mean, it's just so.
They reenact the whole thing. Yeah. It's very interesting. I hadn't thought about that word until you were talking about it, but yeah.
Yeah. It's like a reversal of it. Mm-hmm. Families are families, and so many families have multiple secrets. And one of the lines that I like so much that we mention in the conversation with Elissa is, what happens when half a family is devastated by a tragic story and the other half buries it? I mean, that is just so intense.
Yeah.
I mean, we're all walking around thinking we know our families when there's so much we don't know.
Yeah. Or there's ways we've digested the information so that we don't have to face it on a daily basis, whereas her father was choosing to talk about it all the time. Mm-hmm. You know?
Yeah. It's powerful. Oh my God, there's so much I wanted to talk with her about, like then moving into her grandmother's apartment for a while after she passes. Oh my God.
Yeah, she moves in and there's letters that her father has written to her grandmother. And that's part of how Elissa learns more about their relationship. Yeah,
it's a great book.
It's such a good book, and she's such a great person. And if you're looking for someone to take a writing course from, I would highly recommend her. I got the opportunity to do something with her and Catherine May in Maine. I think it was like 2 or 3 summers ago now, and really good. And we'll put a link in the show notes to all of the workshops that she's doing in the future.
Yeah, so stay tuned for our conversation with Elissa at the end of this episode. So I finished reading Jane Austen's Bookshelf, a rare book collector's quest to find the women writers who shaped a legend. This is by Rebecca Romney. We learned about this book while Rebecca was writing it. We had her on for our year of reading romance. And when she told us about this book, we both squealed. So I had started reading an advanced reader copy when we got it and was really enjoying it. I read the first couple chapters and then thought, okay, I'm going to hold off. I bought a hardcover when it came out in my sweaty little hands here. And then I also listened to it on audio. She narrates the book. So it's really good to get her inflections. You know, you can always tell when a writer's reading their own work. Mm-hmm. And this book is, I mean, it's so many things. It's part memoir. So it's part Rebecca's experience growing up as a reader, becoming a rare book dealer, continuing to be a reader and a researcher, and learning about books through the rare book trade. And then it is also her investigation into who inspired Jane Austen. Because like in Northanger Abbey, for example, she mentions several different writers. The narrator mentioned several different writers in that book that kind of sparked some of this. And for the longest time, literary history just claimed that Jane Austen was the first woman novelist of any merit. When other people would mention earlier writers that came before her, they would say, well, she kind of perfected, I hate to say this, but they were just kind of like hack writers. And Jane Austen took everything to a different level and wrote these novelistic masterpieces. And so as Rebecca Romney goes and starts reading these other women writers, she finds out how amazing they are. In most cases. In one case, it was not the case for a variety of reasons. But so chapter 1 is on Jane Austen. Then it's Frances Burney, Anne Radcliffe, Charlotte Lennox, Hannah More, Charlotte Smith, Elizabeth Inchbald, Hester Lynch Thrale Piozzi, and Maria Edgeworth. And so for each of these writers, she talks about what they were known for and how their stars both rose and then fell, and why they were maybe not included in the canon or taken out of the canon, the literary canon. Fascinating. Each woman's story is fascinating. The one that Rebecca had a challenging time with was Hannah More. She was a moralist, a very staunch Christian writer, and there were too many echoes to Rebecca's childhood and coming out of her religious community that it was kind of challenging for her to read. But she comes around to understanding more in different ways. So I can't recommend this book enough. I love it so much. I think it's an important work of literary history. It's a great memoir about books and how books affect you. And she makes the point that you don't have to be wealthy to be a book collector. You don't even have to collect first editions. I know a lot of people, that's what they think. You know, you got to collect first editions. You could make collections around whatever you're interested in, which is what she recommends, like the big collection she put together on romance novels, the earliest romance novels to more contemporary ones. And that's a collection that she eventually sold to a rare book and manuscript library.
Yeah.
I enjoyed this book so much, and I'm definitely going to keep it close to me on my shelves and read a little bit from some of these women. There's also a book I need to track down, and I'll just read this sentence. So she's talking about the author Anne Radcliffe, who was known for writing Gothic novels. If I want to read a 19th century French novel about Anne Radcliffe as the head of a troupe of vampire hunters, it's only my level of French that's stopping me, not my access to the book. So she's talking about how much things have changed with the internet coming along, is that we have so much more access to books now. Earlier scholars, like in the 80s, who were writing about books and novels in the past, often didn't have access to those books. So they might have been just repeating something some earlier scholar wrote about a book and passing on erroneous information, or just not having that access to the full book. And now you can go to Project Gutenberg and get any of these books and read them on your laptop or e-reader for free.
It just might not be translated, which is what she's saying.
That is it, right, exactly.
Yeah,
that is the thing. But as the memoirist who wrote the Ghosts graphic memoir that you're reading, like, she paid somebody to translate her grandmother's memoir from Mandarin.
Yeah, in the prologue, she doesn't even realize that her grandmother was a famous memoirist. I mean, her memoir that she wrote was a bestseller. So there's a picture of her looking at a laptop, and there it is, like Yale University, you know, all these libraries where it is located. but it's not translated. So then she does hire someone to translate it.
Yeah. I mean, and what an amazing time to be a reader, to have access to these, and to also be able to locate translators.
Yes.
Who can help you with these things.
Yeah.
So this is a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. Again, that's Jane Austen's Bookshelf by Rebecca Romney, out now.
And we should say, we're going to should you might be interested in going over to our BookTube page where we have a conversation with Deanna Rayborn, who wrote Killers of a Certain Age and Kills Well with Others. We have a conversation with her, a Friday Reads, and she talks about her love of this book. I think she and Chris are going to start a movement because they both think it should be, everyone should be reading it and shouldn't be, forgotten about, which I don't know. I mean, hopefully it'll win some awards.
I would hope so.
Yeah.
I'm definitely going to be an advocate for this book as memoir and literary criticism because it does amazing work in multiple fields, I believe.
And does she have a reading list in the back, Chris, to make it easy, like if you want to go and find all these?
Yeah, she does. There is an appendix where she does list books and their description. So what Rebecca has done is she's been collecting these books as well. And she has parameters for herself, as most solvent rare book dealers do, about their own collections.
Right.
How much she can spend and whatnot. And there have been some times when she's purchased something for her shop that may have been involved in this.
She can, walk by and look at.
Yeah, exactly. But there are some interesting descriptions, because there was one, I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it, but there was one description of one of these books where a strawberry had accidentally been dropped on the page.
Oh, no.
And left a mark. But yeah, so there is a list of the books that she discusses regarding each author.
Nice.
Yeah, wonderful.
Well, we did a joint read from the Penguin Book of Ghost Stories from Elizabeth Gaskell to Ambrose Bierce. This was our week to read Green Tea by Sheridan the Fanu. What'd you think, Chris?
Well, I wasn't really into it in the beginning because it's kind of set up as like a case study. It's one of those books where somebody's telling a story that somebody else has told them and or via their records that they've left behind, right? So I was kind of like, okay. But then, something happened and I started getting into it.
Okay.
How about you?
I liked it from the beginning. I mean, I thought it was kind of interesting, like mysterious. He's talking about I got a little confused, who's who and who's talking about what. But he was using words like his master that kind of caught my attention. Well, it starts out with a prologue and then it has chapters, which I think is also interesting. I think this is the first story we've read that way, right? And so the prologue is setting up the idea of who this person is. And one of the things he talks about is he had a trifling scratch and lost 2 of his fingers, which caught my attention right away, right? It set the scene a little bit.
Yeah, so this is like a German physician who treats the body and the spirit.
Yes, which I thought was interesting because I think a lot of physicians don't think about that. He's interested in the metaphysical.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, and I mean, this is at a time when dead bodies are being dug up for doctors to dissect, to learn about the human body more, about how it actually operates and how blood flows and all of that. And body snatching and dissection doesn't play a role in this, but the way things move through the body is a part of this story. And green tea is a part of this story. And I don't want to give too many spoilers.
No, I don't think we should. But I did note illustration because he also talks about illustrating, which made me think exactly like what you're talking about. Not only did they dig up bodies and look at it, but they were educating the next generation of doctors by doing illustrations. And I thought, what a different world these doctors live in today.
Yes,
you know?
Yeah. So it's metaphysical medicine. So the case is about this man who's a vicar, and the doctor learns about him from a woman who he's having dinner at her house. And they start talking about this man's case. He's there at the dinner table, and they have a conversation. So the doctor and the man, and they decide to eventually get together, and the man who is suffering from a condition says he will tell the doctor what's going on.
Right.
Right. And then, okay, this is the thing. The doctor, I don't know, like, it's one of those unreliable narrator situations, right?
I'll keep going.
Well, okay, this is going to be spoilery, and I hate to be spoilery, but, you know, at the end, the doctor denies that the guy was his patient. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. After he says to the guy, if this situation happens, call me right away. And so the doctor goes back to his inn and leaves right away. He goes to another inn 2 miles away so he can sit and think. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, the guy who's suffering, the servant comes like within an hour to say, you know, the condition is back. And he keeps going back to the inn saying, when is he going to return? He doesn't show up until like 1 o'clock the next afternoon. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. So it's like malpractice. And he's trying to make an argument that the guy wasn't his patient. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, you killed him.
Right.
You know? And then he brushes it off as some hereditary thing. I was like, you got to be kidding me.
Little Dr. Arrogance there.
Yes.
Or fear. I don't know. Which was it?
I don't know. I kind of read it as like it was the doctor's ego, the arrogance that can be such a detriment in medicine when doctors think they know everything, or they only see some thing through their lens and they don't consult with other specialists or just another mind to help think things through. I think he was even though he dealt with the spirit, I think he was a very logical guy who wanted to believe what the other man was suffering was caused by something within his system. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
Because he latched onto the whole idea of the tea.
Mm-hmm. That green tea was...
Well, but the whole thing is, too, like the man of the cloth, the vicar, who's the man who's suffering, had been studying paganism and drinking green tea. I mean, the moral of the story is don't drink green tea and study paganism, and then also be careful of the doctor you select for help.
I mean, and I think that moral stands today.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting. Some of the words I wrote down was infected, an illusion, purely disease, hereditary suicidal mania. The man who's suffering at one point even says, I was bullying myself into a false courage. And I thought that is something that I think I'm familiar with, you know? And then the other thing, too, is like they're on a walk, right? The man who's suffering is on a walk with his family, and everybody kind of moseys ahead, but his niece stays with him. And his niece basically saves his life, right? Because she's observant and she sees there's something off with her uncle. And she sticks with him. And he survives. But then the doctor basically gives God the credit. And it's just, it was the niece. Come on. You know, you're not doing shit here, Doc. Like, the niece is doing all the heavy lifting.
Right. Another moral, right? Like, you have to be your own advocate. Medical advocate still stands, right? I know I wrote things like spectral illusions, catalepsy, affections. There were a lot of words in here I had to go look up. Resurrection in power. Yeah.
There was one too that the vicar who's suffering, his prayers are being interrupted, and they're dreadful blasphemies that are being shouted at him. And I was like, wow, that's just like The Exorcist. Mm-hmm. It made me think of that, you know, about how there's the man praying over the child, and you know, Satan is in here as well.
I also looked up green tea because I felt like green tea represented something in this book, and it was a little confusing to me.
But, you know, the whole thing about green tea, when I read A New Home Who'll Follow by Catherine
Yes,
Kirkland,
I was thinking about that.
I was thinking about that, too. And, like, that was one that I read with Sigrid, and we were wondering, like, green tea, because they're always drinking green tea, and that was written in 1830. And we were finally starting to think, like, is it green tea, as in the color tea, or is it new tea? You know, what is it? Right. So I now I feel like I really need to, and I still have a note to like research green tea.
Look up green tea. I'll try to find this. So I read about green tea offline when I was reading reviews of this. So I'll try to look that up too, because there was a lot of feelings about drinking green tea, and that it wasn't good for you and could cause problems. And there was a famous author who wouldn't drink it. So I'll look that up.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So this story is from 1872. It came out in a collection called In a Glass Darkly. And within that collection, I think there were 5 stories. And it was this green tea was the lead story, I believe. And Carmilla is also one of the stories in that collection. And that was his vampire story, which is so good. Yeah. And Fanu was Bram Stoker's boss for a while. They were about a generation apart, I think. So, like,
interesting.
Dracula was like 25 years or so after Carmilla. They're both from Ireland. They were in the same circles in a lot of respects. So it's just interesting to talk about Jane Austen's bookshelf and these women writers who were her inspirations. Here you have Carmilla Fanu inspiring Bram Stoker.
Yeah.
I don't know. I love those kinds of things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say it was my favorite, but I did read it.
Yeah.
I think I was hoping, because I think you've talked about Carmilla and your love for Fanu, I was like, oh, this is going to be really good. And it wasn't like that for me.
No, it wasn't. I mean, the whole setup of it being like a case study kind of gave it a distance. So yes, everyone, if you have read Green Tea, let us know what you think. We're so curious to know what folks are thinking about these stories.
And up next is Harriet Beecher Stowe's The Ghost in the Cap'n Brown House. I'm really curious what this one's going to be about.
All right.
We'll be talking about that one on the next episode.
A little bit of homegirl action.
Yes, that's right. The Harriet Beecher Stowe house isn't far from where we are.
This episode is sponsored by
True Home, a novel by Janet Clare. Swanee Burroughs, the restless, edgy 15-year-old daughter of a scandal-ridden congressman and a beautifully flawed mother, has a penchant for running away from her boarding school, her parents, her sometime boyfriend, and herself. A coming-of-age of both adults and adolescents, True Home, set in a rain-swept Pacific Northwest town where good people float in a morass of bad decisions, is a story of interwoven families, teenage angst, deception, and class, where love and betrayal collide and escape proves deadly. Check the show notes for more information about True Home by Janet Clare. So shall we talk about some fun biblioadventures?
Yes, we had a great day in New York City and Manhattan with Aunt Ellen.
We sure did. We took the train down and she met us in Grand Central, and we went to the Morgan Library to see, catching it in its very last week, the exhibit of Belle DaCosta Green.
Yeah, the Morgan's first librarian. I'm so glad we got to see that.
It was a fantastic exhibit. We've been to other exhibits at the library. I feel like this one was much bigger than the other exhibits we've been to. It encompassed 2 big swaths of the main part of the library. Really.
Yeah, the 2 big exhibition rooms.
Yeah.
I know we saw an Emily Dickinson one there that was in an upstairs smaller gallery. Mm-hmm. But yeah, this is the main exhibit. And I think their next one in that space might be the big Jane Austen 250.
Oh, interesting.
I'm not sure. But
yeah,
no, it was
so good.
I mean, it covered her life and her professional work, her relationships.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, it had letters and photographs, and it had her desk and this gorgeous card catalog with carved wooden drawers. And when you first walked into that second exhibit hall, it's facing you, her desk and that lovely card catalog. So right behind that then is a wall. And on the other side of that, there's a cutout in the wall with lights shining down on some index cards. And you can see the wood carving on the other side of that card catalog as well. And when I was walking over there was a woman standing there reading the index cards. And when she was finished and she kind of looked up, I said, "Are you a librarian?" And she's like, "I am." She's like, "You?" I was like, "Yep." So it's kind of like, of course, we're sitting here reading index cards.
Card, you know? Catalog envy.
But she's like, "I've been trying to explain to my grandkids what a card catalog is and how index cards were used, basically, and that you had to kind of know the subject you wanted, or you had to know the author." So,
oh my God, I have vivid memories of doing that at my library when I was a kid.
Yeah,
100%.
Yeah. And when you're looking at a subject and you're like, not seeing anything, and then you see the "See Also" card. You're like, oh my God. You run to the other side of the card catalog and pull out that drawer.
Yeah. I thought they had a really good mix of personal and professional too. Like you really learned who she was and who her family was. And then the professional, her career, and seeing things like her desk, and then seeing a photo of her sitting at the desk, which is so cool.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah,
so she worked with J.P. Morgan for, what was it, like 8 years or something? I don't remember exactly. But then he died, and she had a little bit of a tense relationship with his children because there were some jealousies regarding the time she spent with him. Because, you know, he was a bibliophile and wanted to hang out in the library and talk with his librarian about things. And then when JP died, his son took over running of the library, and they ended up having a really wonderful working relationship that lasted something like 35 years until the son passed away. And I was happy to hear that.
Yeah.
But so then Belle DeCosta Green, along with the son, oversaw the opening of the library as a public museum.
Right. Yeah, really cool.
Yeah, very cool.
And then we went to Symphony Space on the Upper West Side to see Selected Shorts, which was hosted by the author Meg Wolitzer. And this was called Classics with a Twist. She was a fantastic host, I'd like to say. She has a great sense of humor. So she was introducing the people who were reading these excerpts or full stories that had to do with classics, but with a twist.
With a twist, right? Yes.
And then in between, she would read excerpts from abridged classics by John Atkinson, which was really funny because it was like one sentence descriptions of famous classics. It was very funny.
Yeah, totally funny.
So people that were there were Sarah Roll, who's a very renowned playwright and author, and Maya Hawke, and then Mike Doyle, Sarah Bareilles, Jim Parsons. And Jim Parsons was the ending piece, and he read one titled Jacked by Michael Cunningham, which was a very hilarious retelling of Jack and the Beanstalk.
Oh, gosh, with great comedic timing.
Oh, my God. He was so good. Yes. I mean, what I really learned from this, I mean, which any of you who are audiobook listeners know, the narrator really matters, right? It's not just the story. And he is a comedic actor, and this was a comedic piece, and it was so good.
So good.
And unbeknownst to us, the author, Michael Cunningham, was sitting right in front of us.
Right in front of us. He came in late with, we think, his husband. After the lights were off is when he came and sat down in front of us. And it had a card on it saying Michael Cunningham. So he sat there. He's very tall, and he was sitting kind of in front of Ellen. So I think she had to do some looking around.
Yeah, he's very tall. But it was fun to watch him and his, we think, partner, whoever was there sitting with him, enjoy the presentation of it.
It was really wonderful.
And then the other really cool thing was that Meg Wolitzer has a novel called The Interestings, which I've read. It's a really great novel. And the playwright, Sarah Roll, and the actress and songwriter, Sarah Bareilles, are creating an adaptation of a play for
a musical
sometime off Broadway or on Broadway. We'll see. And so they talked about the process together with Meg, and then Sarah got up and walked over to a grand piano and played a song that she's written for the musical.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Oh my God.
I had no idea what to expect, and I just had such a great time.
Yeah, I had a fantastic time. It was really wonderful. And it's somewhat intimate, the theater, and I think that really helps with something like this. You know, you feel like you're there for a special evening.
Right.
So I would definitely go back and see another one of these. I think they do Selected Shorts every 6 weeks or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and there were some in-jokes occasionally about, you know, people from the Upper West Side, which is where the theater is located. Yeah, really enjoyed it.
Yes, highly recommend getting to see one if you get the chance.
What else? Did you have any other biblioadventures?
I did. My gentleman caller and I, for those of you who are longtime listeners, you might remember that when this podcast started, I didn't have a gentleman caller, and I met him at some point 8 years ago. And so for our anniversary, I got us tickets to go see Matthew Dick's one-man show called The Shovel at Theater Works in Hartford. And I didn't know about this until one of our listeners, Pat, thank you, Pat, emailed us because I talked about Matthew Dick's book, Storyworthy. And she said, hey, Emily, did you know he's going to be in a one-man show in Hartford? I did not. Thank you. I got tickets. And then I ran into Pat at the theater, which was so lovely to get to see her in person. But this is Matthew, an hour and a half, no intermission, telling stories. And the conceit, the reason it's called The Shovel is because it starts by him being with his children, including his 4-year-old son, Charlie, at a beach. And he's collecting, it's the end of the day, and he's collecting their toys, one of which is a beach shovel. And a man comes up to him and insists that it's his shovel. And Matthew really wants to pick a fight with him, but his 4-year-old son is, at his knee, and he knows that's not the right thing to do. So as he's doing that, he then weaves all these stories throughout his life into how he got to be in this place and is holding a shovel and talking to this man. Having just read Storyworthy, I will say that several of his stories in Storyworthy are woven into this, and it was really fun to see how he tied it all together into a neat package. Had a fantastic time. And my gentleman caller, Jim, reminded me that one of our very first dates 8 years ago was to go to Norfolk, Connecticut to see a Speak Up performance done by Matthew Dix and a slew of other people who tell stories live on stage. I hadn't remembered that, so it was very full circle. So thanks again to Pat for telling me about it, and we had a great time. It was only 2 nights. It's not running anymore, but if you ever get a chance to see him, he does run with his wife, Alicia, Speak Up Connecticut, and they have events every so often. So I'll put a link in the show notes to that. And you can also listen to Matthew on the Moth podcast. Several of his stories have been put on that.
Nice. Very cool. Well, I had brunch with a friend at the Wesleyan, RJ Julia, up in Middletown, Connecticut. Lovely time. Unfortunately, the cafe there that's inside the bookstore is closing. And I don't know if they have another organization coming in or not, but we had some food and lovely coffee and sat and talked about books. And then afterwards, there's such a lovely day. I went for a walk. So the bookstore is on Main Street in downtown Middletown, and then the campus, Wesleyan, is just a block away. So I had a really nice walk all around through campus and actually saw that on campus there's actually another RJ bookstore there. It was a Sunday. It was closed. So we'll have to go up there some other time. That's the first thing I thought of, was like, this smells like a biblioadventure.
Yes. And then maybe we can go work in the Wesleyan Library, because I'd like to do that as well.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful library. Yeah. That was nice. It's always nice to hang out in a bookstore and talk about books with a friend.
Be surrounded by books and talk about books.
Yes.
Our favorite thing.
Yes. And then I had a really good browse.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Nice. That's a beautiful bookstore. I love it there. What about upcoming jaunts? Do you have anything on the books?
Well, it's the end of the semester. My last day is coming up. So I'm going to be hopping in the car and driving to Illinois to help my mom. So on the drive out to Illinois, I have some plans. And on the way home, I have some plans as well to see some cool libraries. So more to come on that.
I can't wait for a full report.
How about you?
I have coming up this week, actually, a writing workshop with Betsy Lerner, which is part of why I got her book, The Forest for the Trees, out. The workshop is about first pages and titles. So I immediately went to the library and got all of her books and looked at the titles and the first pages because I was curious. So it should be really fun. I think there's going to be about 15 of us, and it's all anonymous. We submitted our stuff anonymously, and we're going to be reading first pages and titles, and then Betsy's also going to be providing some other reading materials that she recommends. So that should be fun. And then I'm also signed up to do a workshop with Shuli Kaywood.
Nice.
Yeah, she has one coming up on May 28th. It's a Wednesday from 2:30 to 5. The list essay, What Makes a List Become an Essay. There's still space available. I'll put a link in the show notes if you want to sign up. And then also coming up at RJ Julia in Madison on May 20th at 6 p.m., Sarah Moon will be in conversation with her mom, Amy Bloom, about her new young adult novel called Family Week.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm excited about that. I'm interested to see a mother and a daughter talk about books together that are both authors. So that should be a good time.
Yeah. What about upcoming reads?
Speaking of families, I have one called A Family Matter. And this one, a publicist reached out to us about it, and it caught my attention right away. It's by the author Claire Lynch, and its pub date is June 3rd, right around the corner. And apparently she was out on book tour for her memoir called Small on Motherhood, which is about she and her wife's experience getting pregnant. And she noticed when she was on book tour the state, or should we say the erosion of women's rights. And that's what led her to write this book, I guess, which is a novel called A Family Matter. And it takes place in two timelines, 1982 and 2022, so more recent, and the rights of lesbian moms. Really interested to read it. It kind of looks like one of those one gulp reads. So I'm hoping for maybe a little hammock time where I can sit down with this one and just enjoy it.
Nice.
What about you?
I have a short stack here of things that'll be going with me on my road trip. The Belgian Girls, a novel. This is by Catherine J. Atwood. And I've read several of Catherine's nonfiction works, and I know I've talked about them on the podcast here. They are heroes of World War II. She also has heroes of World War I, courageous women of the Vietnam War. For World War II, she has one that focuses on the Pacific Theater, which a lot of people sometimes forget about, that World War II, I mean, it was a world war. It didn't just happen in Europe. It was also raging in the Pacific. And then another collection on stories of espionage. And these are usually aimed at young adults, but they're great reading for adults as well. And they're short biographies of women who did amazing work in these war zones. But this Belgian Girls, it's her first novel. It's also categorized as a young adult, and it's in two timelines. So World War I and then World War II. So I look forward to this very much. She can tell a good story. A book that arrived is 52 Ways to Reconcile, How to Talk with Indigenous Peoples on the Path to Healing. This is by David A. Robertson, and it is 52 different things that you can do, as the title promises. And the table of contents are listed as week 1, week 2. So having a movie night, starting an Indigenous book club. Some things are shorter, some things are more intense. You know, it's geared toward Canadian. This is a Canadian book, but I think it would be applicable towards any Indigenous population. You would be able to do similar things for whatever population or country, continent you would want to focus on. And I don't mean to take anything away from Indigenous Canadians at all when I say that. Concrete and practical. Again, 52 Ways to Reconcile by David Robertson. And then this next book I want to talk about is one that MLA sent us review copy of, A Century of Queer Korean Fiction. This is edited and translated by Samuel Perry. The introduction is quite long, and it has recommendations for further reading. But this is where I'm showing Emily, like, where the stories start, which is, you know, at least the third, almost halfway in. It's 9 stories, and I look forward to reading them. I figured I might read one a day while I'm gone, and we don't do a great job of following the reading months. We do some of them like we always do Nonfiction November. But May is Asian and Pacific American Heritage Month, so this book would fit nicely into that reading month. And then also June is Pride Month, so it would fit into that as well. And I'm looking forward to this very much. I don't think I've ever read a queer Korean story that I can remember. So thank you to MLA for sending us this copy of A Century of Queer Korean Fiction by Samuel Perry. It's kind of cool that he edited and translated. So, like, you know, talk about doing good work to get people's stories out there.
Mm-hmm. In the Out Now category, these are books we've spoken about on prior episodes, but they hadn't published yet. Speak to Me of Home by Janine Cummins and Food Person by Adam Roberts.
Nice. Well, coming up next is our conversation with Elissa Altman. Happy reading. We are thrilled to welcome Elissa Altman to the podcast. She's a memoirist who has written 3 previous books, Motherland, Trafe, and Poor Man's Feast. She won a James Beard Award for her narrative food blog, also titled Poor Man's Feast. Her newest memoir, Permission, tells the story of her banishment by family members due to 8 lines in one of her books that revealed a secret. That this was a secret came as a complete surprise to her, which she explains in Permission. Permission delves into the art of writing and asks the question, how do we mine the depths of our own lives for stories, and do we have the permission to tell them? Elissa lives in Connecticut with her wife, Susan Turner, a book designer, and their adorable golden retriever, Fergus. We've also just found out that she has 2 cats who sabotage her sometimes on Zoom. So if you hear wonderful cat noises, now you know. Welcome, Elissa.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And thank you also for mentioning my lovely animals. As we speak, Fergus is at the vet. Something happened to his foot, and so Susan and I are complete wrecks. So, but all of our devices are off. So, they know that I'm doing this. Yeah. So,
hopefully, all's good with Fergus.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah.
He is, as we like to say, we're middle aged. He is of a certain age, so problems do, come up.
They crop up. He's a grown up. Well, he'll never be a grown up, but he is a grown up. He's an absolute love. 85 pounds of golden retriever love. Yeah.
So nice. Well, we thought we would do something a little different. In the book, Permission, you talk a lot about your writing desks, and you talk about notebooks versus journals. So we thought we would just ask you first about your process and how you write and where you write and what you write with.
Yeah. That's a really great question. Well, as I am talking to you right now, I am talking to you from the gigantic Irish pine antique desk that I have in my office that I know that I wrote about in the book. This is the place where I do. I mean, if you saw it, right? I mean, if I turned my screen around and you saw it, you just wouldn't believe it. But I'm afraid if I did that, I would screw up the podcast and I wouldn't be able to get back to you because I'm technologically incompetent. But so I'm right. I'm talking to you from the big pine desk where I do my work. I have teaching contracts, some that I'm looking at right now, and I teach from here. I will often write, when I'm going from handwritten to typed, I'll do my typing, my keyboarding here, my keyboarding here. They sound like I'm Methuselah, when I say my typing, clack, clack, clack,
It's okay, Elissa. We remember those. We use them too.
Yeah. So you remember whiteout also,
yes.
Right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And then if you didn't let it dry well enough, and then you started to try to type again. Yeah.
It was great.
Yeah.
And behind me, let's see if I can just move this just a little bit. Right there is that is the desk that I reserve really just for sort of, writing by hand, writing in my journal. Sometimes I'll sit there and I'll read actual, books. And the reason that exists, that desk used to live in our guest room. And I had a low bookcase here under the window, and people would come in, like, if my mom was here, she would come in and she'd sit down and torture me while I, from over my shoulder while I was working. And then I realized, that I needed a secondary place to write that wasn't covered in paper and that was not touched by bills and contracts and taxes and all of that kind of stuff. A lot of that also came out of the fact that I am my mother's caregiver. And even though she lives in a different city, in a different state, I am responsible for keeping her afloat. I'm responsible for her paperwork. I deal with the medical stuff and the insurance stuff, and which can take enormous amounts of time, and it can take up enormous amounts of room. And I also feel, and this is going to sound ridiculously romantic, but I also feel that the work that we do, whether we're writers or painters or photographers, whatever it is that we do, has to have a space that is, I think, almost sacred. That is, you do that and that alone in that space. And so I break out in hives if I come into my office and I find that my wife of 25 years, who I love, has dumped something on my desk just because it's the only empty space. It's the only empty space. And I'm like, and it makes me crazy. And she's very patient. So I do my writing by hand on that desk. And I've sometimes done the odd podcast from there, video cast from there, but very infrequently. And, I would like to say, talking about process, I would like to say that everything that I write starts out written by hand. And it did for a while, but it doesn't right now. I would like to get back to that because I think that it slows us down. And that's really important. We live in a world where fast is everything. I remember Danny Shapiro saying once that often when we write our manuscripts in Microsoft Word straight out of the gate, they inevitably wind up looking more finished than they have any right to be in first drafts and in that kind of thing. And I agree with that completely. So, I've got my box of very romantic Blackwing pencils over here that Santa brought me, which was very nice. And I would like to say that
write with pencils? You start by writing with pencils?
I write usually with pen, but Susan bought me Blackwing pencils and I love them. And, Anne Lamott calls it that scritch, scritch, scritch sound. That's like as old as time, basically. Yeah. So I like writing and being able to cross things out and having arrows pointing, I totally love, like when you go to an exhibit. I remember once going to an exhibit of Charles Dickens manuscripts and seeing like where he crossed stuff out and I was like, wow, so this is a thing. Like we all do that. Right, yeah. We all do this.
The process on the page. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really nice to see that, it's really grounding and nice to see that. So that's a long way of answering your question. Yeah.
Well, we want to let the listeners know, too, that sacred writing space desk faces a window, which is lovely to get that natural light coming in when you're doing that kind of writing.
Yes. And if you were here right now, you would see the lilac that is in bloom right outside my window. And when the wind is right, I get that lovely gust of sweetness coming into my office, which is just delicious. It's great.
Yeah. Now, do you have a favorite pen type?
Do I have a favorite pen type? I am oddly not as neurotic about my pens as I am about my journals and my desks. I will write with everything from let me see if I can grab it. Oh boy. I have this Coeco rollerball that Susan bought me a couple of years ago. And I've also discovered these really wonderful Japanese pens. There's a really terrific source online called St. Louis Art Supply Company. And you can get really interesting pens from there. They're really mostly very inexpensive. So, if you don't like it, it's not a huge waste of money. I love writing with a fountain pen, and I have several of them, including some antique ones that need to be revamped and modernized. But I have a really lovely Coeco brass fountain pen that's Arthur. If you just heard him shriek, there's Arthur.
Hi, Arthur.
He's in agreement on the pen question. Hi, sweetheart. Yes, and he's also almost 25 pounds. Wow. So he's a large fella. So I have a brass Coeco fountain pen that I love to use. I find that it requires, at least for me, it requires a different kind of paper. And that's like a whole other level of neuroses.
Yes, we should say that in the book Permission, there is a whole chapter devoted to journals and notebooks.
Yes.
And the concept of the difference between a journal and a notebook. Would you like, because that was really interesting to me. Would you want to briefly explain what the difference is?
Yes. And I hope I don't contradict myself, but because I talk about the journal notebook thing a lot. People are really curious about it. And if you spend as much time as I unfortunately do on Instagram, when you go into like the trending page, there are like hundreds of fanatical journaling people who it's like, where do you get the time? I don't with the tape and the pictures and and I mean, I do have, one of those Travelers Paper Republic notebooks that I'm using exclusively now for like my date book. And I love it, but I wouldn't put Hello Kitty tape in it. I just wouldn't do that, or any of those other things. I wouldn't do that. But so I think that for me, the difference between a journal, journal it comes from the word jour, it comes from the word day, and it implies a daily practice of, waking up or whenever during the day. I think earlier is probably usually better for most people. And sitting down and writing daily or almost daily. And notebooks for me are much more work connected. They're much more tied into process. Ruth Ozeki, the wonderful novelist, once was talking about a process. She actually calls it a process journal, which she keeps, I gather, for every book that she writes, simultaneous to the actual writing of the book itself. And so she has a resource to go back to review what's happening here in this chapter. What are the creative hurdles that she's living through and experiencing from an artistic standpoint. And I liken those to the notebooks. Oh, hello. Yes. Okay. Sorry. More hello from Arthur. I liken those to the notebooks that we often see in exhibitions at museums. Mm-hmm. So, which I actually often prefer. I prefer them to the actual exhibitions because it's like looking under the hood. It's like peeking under the hood. What's going on in that in that brain. I think about like Da Vinci's notebooks are, extraordinary. And I think Van Gogh's were extraordinary. So I think that they're very different. Notebooks for me tend to be much more practice and work oriented, and journals contain things that I would just vaporize if anybody ever read them, and I think that's probably that's Pip. They're all here to comment.
Right.
The whole gang's together.
I'm so sorry about that.
No,
I really am. Yeah. Thank you. So I hope that's clear. I will say that I am, when I keep coming back to the word neurotic, I am neurotic enough about journals and notebooks that I have stacks of them. I have stacks of them that I have never written in. I have stacks of them that are really old and I haven't written in them, which means that I schlep them from place to place with me. Mm-hmm. Like when I've moved, I have notebooks from the Harvard Coupe that I bought in 1983 when I was a sophomore at Boston University. So that's kind of a crazy thing. And I actually just wrote an essay on Substack about the terror of the blank journal and what that can do to some of us psychologically.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I just had a conversation with a colleague last night at work about blank journals and expensive journals and whatnot.
So you're not alone.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that.
We had a question. We were talking before we logged on. The Permission is a memoir. It's a writing book. It's a motivational writing book on helping new memoirists. It's family history. It's so many different things. But along the way, you quote so many different writers, and this is kind of loosely related to notebooks, I suppose. How do you keep track of that? Like, how do you keep yourself organized when you're writing to make sure that you include these things that you want to include?
I have a commonplace book. And for those listeners who don't know what a commonplace book is or are not familiar with it, it is a very old concept. It's an old practice that goes back, hundreds and hundreds of years. I want to say the first commonplace books were kept around the 16th century. I would be inclined to say they're probably older, but we just haven't seen them. So a commonplace book is a book that you devote to keeping quotes from other people and thoughts from other people and excerpts from other people. And I really don't ever let this out of my sight. And it's become an important part of my practice to always have this by my side, partially because my memory stinks. My memory is terrible. But also because, there's so much wisdom out there and so much artistic thought that exists in the world that we live in, that if we slow down enough, we come across it, we see it, we notice it. For me, there's really no other way to keep track of them except in my commonplace book. If I'm in the process of actively writing something the way I was with permission, I always had my commonplace book on my desk. When you were mentioning it, you saw me reach behind the computer. There's a little shelf behind my computer where I keep sort of the most important things that I am always reaching for. And this is one of them. But when when I'm in the throes of writing something, very often what will happen is I will refer to the commonplace book, and then I will go back and pull the source of the quote off my shelf, my big shelf, which is right there. For example, I quote Victoria Chang quite a bit. Victoria's quotes originally found their way into my commonplace book. And then when I was writing the book itself, I pulled them off my shelf and I had a stack that was like, up to here. There are certain things that I find myself going back to also over and over again, like the work of Mark Doty, who is one of my favorite poets. He's also one of my favorite memoirists who changed everything for me in terms of what a memoir could be and what a memoir could do and what it could sound like. And his extraordinary memoir about his partner, Wally, dying of AIDS in the late 1980s, early 90s. It's called Heaven's Coast. I knew him as a poet, but this book changed everything for me and changed the world of narrative possibility for me. And so my copy, I actually have like 3 copies of that book because they've all sort of fallen apart at this point. And so I have those books sort of underscored, and then I have his essays printed out, and I'm always referring back to his essays, and I keep those in a folder on my desk, like at all times. So, I think it was Jane Kenyon who said, surround yourself with good sentences and good words. And that is something that I try and actively do always.
No wonder Susan can't find any place to put the bills on your desk.
Right.
Well, Elissa, one of the things that I think is so interesting about your writing, and this happened for me when I read your memoir, Motherland, which is about your mother, who is a narcissist and is still very much alive.
Yes.
That it felt really brave to me that you wrote that while she was still alive. And I recently read a memoir by someone who in the back in the acknowledgement said, I had to wait for certain members of my family to die before I could write this book.
Yes.
How does that make you feel when people say that, considering that you've done so much writing about people who are alive, and then also with permission, it is about people who are no longer with us?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that it's different for everybody. There's no black and white. There's no right or wrong. And Arthur, again, agrees with me. There's no right or wrong way to do it. I think it's an immensely personal decision. I would always caution, and I do always caution, new writers to really think about what they're doing before they do it, before they hit the publish button. We live in a world now of instant publication. I look at Substack, and some of the most wonderful writers I know are on Substack, like Jeanette Winterson is on it, and Catherine, and it's just really a wonder. I think it's a wonderful place for writers to be at every level. But the flip side of that is, like I said, we live in a world of instant publication. We can self-publishing when back in the day in the 90s when I was in book publishing, that was not really an option. I mean, you could, but it's a whole other universe now. So I caution my students to really give it a lot of thought. I could never and would never presume to tell a new writer, or a seasoned writer for that matter, what the right thing is to do for them. Family relationships and other relationships are complicated. If nothing else, I have learned the hard way that it's usually the things that we couldn't even imagine setting people off. That sets them off. And so it's a moving target. So that's another part of the conversation as well. I mean, I've known people who have held off writing things that were really important because of, A, B, and C. And then when they finally went ahead and did it, there was no reaction. Mm. And then that becomes, time lost. I think that timing in writing, certainly in writing memoir, is also really important. So, I always knew that I was going to write about my mother. My mother and I, from my first breath, we were kind of oil and water. My mother didn't know, having read the book, Emily, that my mother didn't know she was pregnant for 6 months. How does something like that happen? Well, for a lot of physiological reasons that happened to her. But completely disconnected from her body in so many ways. And I needed to be able to write my way through our story. I wrote essays, and I had a column in the Washington Post that was about her, that she knew about. But I also needed to take my time with it and take a step back and think about intent and motivation, which are also things that I talk about in Permission. Yes. And it's, again, when students come to me or new writers come to me and they're like, I really want to do this thing, I want to write this thing, but I have to wait till everybody dies. And one of the questions that I ask them, the two questions that I ask them are, what is your intent and what is your motivation? What is driving you to do this? And what do you think waiting will accomplish for you? It might be the thing that you need to do. That's totally fine. No judgment for me whatsoever. But for me, I knew that I had to write about it while she was still here, because I needed it to be a snapshot of two women aging in tandem, two women going through their lives in tandem, with a certain amount of backstory and with a certain amount of, this is who we are and this is how we got to this crazy place. If I said to her, can I have your permission to write it? She probably would have said yes, because as you said, she's clinically diagnosed NPD. She has narcissistic personality disorder. And when you ask an NPD if you can write something about them, they say yes.
Right. They're thrilled. Yes.
Right. And it was gratifying when the book came out. And I had to be very responsible and really careful. But it was gratifying when the book came out and she read it, that she came back to me and said, it's 95% accurate. Mm. Because people with narcissism, who live with narcissism, cannot see that as a rule. They can't let go of the reins long enough to accept the way someone else sees them, the way the outside world sees them. That said, I think that there are probably a lot of cases. I think it's more common than not for especially a new writer to make the decision to wait because it's very scary and we don't want to hurt the people in our lives and we don't want to overturn the apple cart. And even if we write something that is, not necessarily glowing, but real and compassionate and involves a certain level of creative transcendence, we still don't know how that person is going to feel about the act of doing it. And it differs for every one of us.
Right. And then sometimes you write something that you don't think is a secret and it's a secret. Which
That's
is
exactly right.
What happened with permission, right?
Right. That's right. Yeah.
I mean, I have talked about reading permission on previous episodes, but we should probably give you an opportunity to briefly tell people what this secret is that we keep alluding to.
Yeah. So in 1926, when my father was 3 years old and my aunt was 8 years old, my grandmother walked out on them. And she came back. It was about 3 years later, although in some places it looks like 4 years. That's the benefit of, Ancestry.com and 23andMe. You can actually see, you can research. And my father had always told me that it was 3 years. But having looked at files on Ancestry, I could see that they were still living as boarders. My father and my grandfather and my aunt were still living as boarders 4 years later. Mm-hmm. So, time changes, stories change. It's like the game of telephone. But I was raised with this story. My father, with whom I was very, very close, he and I were probably, as we both got older, we were both probably could best be described as friends. He was very, very dear to me, and I am very protective of him, and he was very protective of me. And yet I was his sounding board, and he, in the most mundane of situations, we could be out walking the dog, we could be sitting at a restaurant, we could be walking through Central Park, we could be grocery shopping, and he would talk about the fact that his mother had walked out. It would just come up in some context, contextually connected to the act, to what we were doing at the time. And I think that he did it in part. There was no malice. I don't believe there was any malice, certainly not intended. But I think that he was using me effectively as a sounding board. And he used me and the act of telling that story over and over and over again as a way to metabolize this enormous trauma in his life. He had clearly been told at some point to never talk about it. Probably my aunt told him that. My aunt was an incredible woman, very strong personality, family matriarch type of person, looked just like Ava Gardner, that gorgeous, And, my grandparents were immigrants. My father and my aunt were born here, but my grandparents were immigrants, and they were trying to get a toehold in the American community and in their community. And having a story out there of, mom walking out was not going to help anybody. It was not going to be good for anybody. So he clearly had been told by someone to not tell the story, and he didn't. And he, as I write in permission, I know that he wound up in analysis 5 days a week in the 1950s when he was a madman. My dad was a madman ad man, like right out of the television show, with the teak furniture and the whole thing and the Brooks Brothers suits and all of that. But so he had this other side to him, and he would tell the story. As a result, I grew up with a sort of overwrought fear of abandonment, a profound fear of abandonment. So, if my parents went out to the movies on a Saturday night when I was 8 years old, I was just the side of hysterical because I wasn't sure if they were going to come back or not, because often parents didn't come back. That was a real thing that happened. When I went away to sleepaway camp the first year I was there, I have counselors from that time who were dear friends of mine. One of them signed my marriage license, and they remember me crying constantly, far beyond the sort of acceptable limitations of homesickness, And so that's what resulted in my life. What I didn't know, and this is the secret, is that while my father was telling me this story, almost every weekend, every time we had private time, alone together, my aunt hid it from her family. So my cousins, who are significantly older than I, one is 12 years older than I, and her sister is 16 years older than I, didn't know. So when the book came out, when Poor Man's Feast came out in 2013, and there was that 8-line paragraph towards the end of the book, which was connected to, why my father and I were so needful of sustenance and nurturing and heart saving and all of those things. They didn't know that grandma walked out, because my grandmother was their grandmother as well. And by a year later, I had been completely excised from that side of my family, to a degree that even now, all these years later, remains shocking to me. So we were godparents to the granddaughter of one of my older cousins, and that's not the case anymore. And we are no longer invited to family functions. And having been as close to these people as though we were siblings,
which is why some people wait to write, right?
Right, right. Which is what, right? Yeah, but here's the question: is a secret if you don't know it's a secret?
Right,
right.
And different people's way of metabolizing things. I mean, that's what's so fascinating. Chris and I were talking about it. There was that passage that you read.
What happens when half a family is devastated by a tragic story and the other half buries it?
Mm-hmm. And what's so interesting in your story is that also what I think is fascinating is how people do metabolize information, right? So maybe it wasn't even that they didn't know. It's that the way they metabolized it to believe that. So your aunt then makes everything in her world very perfect.
Absolutely.
Which I find psychology is so fascinating.
It is. And I mean, she was this kind of beautiful, polished, extraordinary at everything she did, spoke a bunch of languages fluently, was a teacher in the New York school system, was avid, just loved music, loved art, exposed her children to every manner of the art world, and was an incredible party thrower and a really good cook. But everything had to be, all the ducks had to be in a row. Everything had to be lined up, all the T's crossed, all the I's dotted, all the time. And there's a really great picture of her that I have from 1938. I want to say she and my father both went to sleepaway camp, as I mentioned, as did I. And she's standing in front of she was a counselor, and she was standing in front of a bunk with her arms around her, 6 girls who were her charges. And there was a label on the side of the bunk, a pennant on the side of the bunk that said "Honor Bunk," and it was like, of course,
overachiever everywhere,
overachiever everywhere, and expected nothing less from other members of the family. Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
You have to have it all.
Yeah. I was just going to say too, like talking about you being like the sounding board for your father, your mother, his ex-wife, used that against him.
Yes.
That his mother left. So like how re-traumatizing. I mean, you talk about complex PTSD, which I don't think a lot of people understand what that is, but just, lifelong from childhood well into adulthood trying to process what happened.
Yeah. And I mean, they were the world's worst couple. They really were. I mean, they were a beautiful couple. They were one of those couples that, I often post pictures that I actually took of them when I was 7 out in California when we were out there in 1970. And they were just this gorgeous couple, beautiful. They lived in a way that can only be described as acrimonious every minute of every day. And my mother could be, and still is, can be brutal. Mm-hmm. She has a way of honing in like right to the Achilles heel,
where the wound is. Yeah.
Where the wound is.
Yeah.
And she would say to him, apropos of nothing, they could be fighting about something else. And she would say, your mother didn't love you, your mother left. And, and I describe it in the book as it was like she was pulling a switchblade from her pocket, and my father would just blanch, he just like the color would drain out of his face. And so they were married for 16 really difficult years. And, when he heard this all the time, and I heard it because I was there, so I would listen to that. I would listen to it. And so it was the fact of her leaving was always there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't want to get too woo-woo, but I do believe that children pick their parents. So it doesn't surprise me that here you are and you're writing these beautiful memoirs that help other people to heal their wounds. And I wanted to ask one question about editing. Chris and I were recently at an event with Maura Casey, who wrote a new memoir called Saving Ellen. And it's in large part about her sister and her sister's need for kidney transplant at a time when it was unheard of. But she talked about how she wanted to write a part about her own experience with sexual trauma. And when she first wrote about it, it took up not a lot of the book, but maybe it was a chapter or something. And she talked about it in word count, which I'm not very good about. But yeah. And then it went to the editor, and the editor was like, yeah, you need to go and write this, or might have the order wrong. Maybe she wrote about it. Yeah,
I think the editor told her, you need to write everything about this as a separate thing and get it all out.
That's what she did. And she wrote a lot. Yeah. And then it ended up being like 450 words in the memoir or something.
Yeah.
And you talking about an experience. I'm getting to this question about editing. Like you talk about an experience in your book where you had written something that you felt like was great and should be there. And your editor was like, yeah, no, that's for you and not for this book.
That's right.
Can you talk about what it's like? Because I think editing when it's not fiction is much different than when it's like, well, you're asking me to edit my life,
right?
Or an experience.
Yeah, I think it was my second book. I had written around 40 pages it was actually 40 pages about a relationship that I had with a certain family member. And it was brutal. I mean, I was emotionally brutalized by this person. There was just no other way to describe it. We had been very close at one point, and then we weren't. And we had a relationship that became really devastating. Lots of therapy, lots and lots of therapy. And like grief counseling, to get to the other side of the relationship. It was really overwhelming. And I had an enormous amount of anger and rage towards this person. And I wrote 40 pages basically venting my spleen. And I think in Permission, I talk about it it's either in the revenge chapter or the risk chapter, probably the revenge writing chapter. Mm-hmm. Revenge writing is a very bad idea from a craft standpoint. So I wrote this, and everything in it was tactile, and it was immediate and important to the story, I felt. And those are two words that are really important, I felt. And I sent it off to my editor, and she sent the manuscript back, and those 40 pages had big delete marks through them, like that, the proverbial cutting room floor. I didn't kick and scream because I really value editorial. As a former editor myself, I value editorial work, and really good, thoughtful editors are worth their weight in gold. They really are. But I was aghast. This is great writing, and what are you doing? And this has to be in the book, and this has to be in the story. And she said it is great writing. It is very good writing, but it has nothing to do with the story. And we went back and forth, and I took it out. I had to take it out. And then when I read the next draft of the manuscript, I was like, well, that's a whole lot better. That's a whole lot better. Because it was a distraction. It was a diversion. It had no meaning really to the story. And when I say I was venting my spleen, that's exactly what I was doing. Mm-hmm. And writers have to understand that when they're writing, I think even fiction, or autofiction, or, whatever you want to call it, real life comes out on the page. Mm-hmm. It just does. Yeah. And I think that, probably a lot of people would argue that point with me, and that's fine. But I think that that's true. We have to make absolutely sure, again, what is our intent and what is our motivation? We have to make absolutely sure that we are not using the page to drag someone through the mud. And I've said this a lot on tour that, it's not fair to the story, because what happens is the story winds up spinning. The narrator, you or the narrator, your character is the narrator. The story winds up spinning. And you're also asking the reader to slog through the poison of someone else's unfinished business. And that's not okay.
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, considering the reader, it's been something we've talked about recently too, like what do writers owe to the reader? Nothing in so many ways, but in other ways you do owe them a good story.
Yeah, I have to really be clear about the fact that when I'm teaching or when I'm reading someone's new work, that I really want my students to create their earliest drafts without an eye to the reader. For sure. Pretend that the reader, isn't involved. You're crafting what you're crafting because you're trying to tell a story, because you're trying to get to a certain place, I think, of understanding. I always say that if I don't come out of the writing of a memoir a different person than the person I was when I went into it, then I'm not doing it right. So there has to be a certain level of transcendence. And by that, I mean, we have to know something about ourselves coming out of it that we didn't know going into it. That's really important. But in the same way, a painter will not stand at their easel and say, well, what is the critic going to say about this? Or what is the, I guess unless they're commissioned to do it, which is a whole other story. But in the earliest stages of drafting a manuscript, drafting a story, I think it's really important to leave the reader out of it. But as you begin to go into second drafts and third drafts, you have to ask yourself, what is the intention? What is my motivation for telling the story? And will the reader feel like a narrator isn't trustworthy if they get stuck in this sort of quicksand, this narrative quicksand that they can't climb out of, and they have no idea why they're there? Mm-hmm. I don't think that that's fair.
Yeah. I thank God for good editors, right? Like you said,
right.
and teachers as well to help guide new writers. And like you said, even experienced writers need help and guidance and seeing what's actually on the page.
Yeah.
Elissa, we've kept you much past your allotted time here. You're so fun to talk to.
Oh, that's okay. It's great to talk to you. I feel like we could go on for a while. So
yeah, we'd love to be students in one of your workshops.
Yes.
Well, you have been.
I had the great opportunity. One of my favorite stories to tell about that time I had with you and Catherine May in Maine is that Catherine had the morning and you had the afternoon, and Catherine starts and we're all poised with our notebooks and our pens. And she's like, the first thing I'd like you to do is put away your notebooks and your pens. And there was like a gasp, And then in the afternoon, such relief when Elissa was like, I'd like you to take out your notebook and pens. Like, yes.
Yeah, she's an extraordinary teacher. And she's a wonderful writer and a wonderful friend. And I'm very, very lucky to have her in my life. So,
yeah, it's fun. And it was an honor for me and very life-changing for me that time. And
I'm so glad.
We will put in link in the show notes to your course. You teach different courses in different places at beautiful venues all over and online. So we will definitely put a link there for people.
Great. That's wonderful.
And we wish you so much luck with the rest of the launch of Permission, which is available now. Go to your local indie, get yourself a copy, buy them for your friends. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to The Book Cougars with Chris Wallach and Emily Fine. We'll be back again with another episode in 2 weeks. Until then, come chat with us on social media, Goodreads, or email us at bookcougars@gmail.com. If you'd like to help support our podcast, please tell others about us, leave a review wherever you listen, and consider becoming a patron. Even $1 a month is a big help. Learn more about that on our website, bookcougars.com, where you'll find the show notes for this and all of our past episodes.
Thanks, everybody.
This episode was edited by Pat Keogh Sound Design.